The Battlecruiser Hiei was one of four such built for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Hiei and her sisters besides Kongo were some of the first capital ships constructed in Japan. Powerfully armed with 8 14-inch guns and 16 6-inch guns, Hiei was complete in August 1914 in time to help with the capture of German colonies and not much more during the Great War. During the interwar period, Hiei, to comply with the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty and to avoid scrapping, was transformed into a demilitarized training ship. Through removing her main belt armor, reducing her top speed to 18 knots, removing her after 14-inch gun turret, and later all of her 6-inch guns, despite this mutilation of her fighting power, she was refit and ready for service before the entry of Japan into the Second World War. In this, she helped to cover the Japanese striking force that attacked Pearl Harbor and then the Indian Ocean raid. Hiei next sorted with Kondo's invasion force for Midway Island in June 1942. After this failure, she went to the South Pacific, helping in several carrier duels, and finally, in November 1942, under the command of Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, she and her sister Kirishima, along with cruisers and destroyers, were to bombard Henderson Airfield, where they were met by American cruisers and destroyers under the command of Admiral Callahan. In this night action, through the combination of destroyer, cruiser, and later aircraft, Hiei was sunk, being hit numerous times throughout the morning and day of the 13th. Following the introduction of the world's first battlecruiser, HMS Invincible, the Imperial Japanese Navy was determined to build a superior ship. The Japanese worked away at their 18,725-ton design. However, the British had laid down the much more advanced and larger 26,000-ton HMS Lion. Seeing how their design was obsolete, the Japanese requested British help and expertise. Accordingly, in 1910, the Japanese placed an order with the British firm Vickers, where the first of the Kongo class, Kongo, was built. Kongo was the last Imperial Japanese ship built outside of Japan. These first true battlecruisers built for the Imperial Japanese Navy were designed by Sir George Thurston of Vickers. Like many of you pointed out on the video on Tiger, the Kongos look similar, with the general differences being the Kongos were heavier and carried a heavier armament. The quote mark still is the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific. The Kongo class was built as a battlecruiser class, and as such, possessed relatively light protection. Even after extensive modernization, the class's weakness remained its inadequate protection. As built, the entire weight of armor on the ship was 6,500 tons, or some 25% of the standard displacement. The main belt armor was 8 inches at the waterline and 6 inches below. The main belt tapered to 3 inches at the ends, while the barbettes had 10 inches of Vickers cemented armor, and the turret faces were 9 inches, while the roofs had 3 inches, and the rest of the ship was limited to 2 inches of armored deck. With a lack of armor, the Kongos followed Admiral Fisher's idea of speed as armor. Having a speed of 27.5 knots provided by Parsons turbines from steam generated by 36 Yarrow boilers. The original boilers were coal-fired with oil spray. Before we continue with some of the general characteristics, it should be noted that Hiei, although built in Japan, was built with a large number of parts imported from Britain. The Kongos were originally planned to carry 12-inch guns. Upon learning about the British plan to use the 13.5-inch gun for Lion, and anticipating the American move to the 14-inch gun, they decided to upgun the Kongos. So, with help from the British, who were always happy to help paying customers, they developed 14-inch guns for the class. The guns were arranged in twin turrets along the center line of the ship, 2 forward, 1 close behind the third funnel, and 1 further aft. The secondary battery was made up of 16 6-inch guns and casemates, 8 per side. This was a rather large amount and reflected the Japanese fear of torpedo attacks. They did have smaller caliber guns as well when complete, notably 3-inch guns and machine guns. The Kongos were also given a hefty torpedo armament, the heaviest of any capital ship of their day, with 8 submerged torpedo tubes. As I mentioned at the start of the video, Hiei was complete right at the start of World War I, wherein she helped in the occupation of the German colonies in the Caroline, Marshall, and Mariana Islands, along with helping in the capture of Tsingtao. Her service in the First World War isn't all that exciting, mostly consisting of training and patrols along the Chinese and Korean coasts, and the British asking for the Kongos as loaners, with the Japanese not wanting to help. So we'll skip ahead a bit to make things more interesting for Hiei. Like some of the other signatories of the Washington Naval Treaty, notably the United Kingdom and the United States, Japan had to reduce her fleet to comply with the terms of the treaty, meaning that the Japanese would have 3 World War I era classes in service still: the Kongos, the Isseis, and the Fusos. Throughout the 1920s, Hiei performed roles in the intervention in the Russian Civil War and aiding people in the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. While for a majority of the decade, she was quietly performing the duty of training Japanese sailors for her growing navy. Unlike her sisters in the late 1920s and early 30s, Hiei did not receive modernization, at least not yet. Instead, to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty, and so Hiei wouldn't have to be scrapped, in 1929, to quote warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 1869 to 1945, she was taken in hand for demilitarization. To conform with the terms of the Washington Treaty, she lost one 14-inch gun turret, her side armor, and the number of boilers was reduced. Despite this mutilation of her fighting power, she was brought back to the standard of her three sisters in time for World War II. Like it was mentioned, Hiei lost her aft 14-inch gun turret, lost one of her smokestacks because 25 of her boilers were removed, and subsequently her speed dropped to 18 knots. Later on, her secondary battery was reduced to 0. The United States did similar things to battleships. However, the Japanese kept Hiei's armor and guns in storage, just in case she might need them. This refit was completed in 1932 when Hiei became a full-time training ship, instead of an active warship on training. This was her permanent role. She spent most of the 1930s doing this training, where in 1933 she was refit to accommodate the Emperor, becoming essentially the Emperor's ship, where she conducted the Emperor around for naval reviews and trips around Japan. Hiei served in this training ship/Emperor's yacht role for only 5 years or so, as Japan began her imperial expansion into Asia. Notably in 1933 when they invaded Manchuria and subsequently left the League of Nations and the naval treaty systems not too long after, where Hiei and her sisters would receive more radical modernization. Hiei was the last of this four to receive the modernization. To take from Still again, protection on the ships was increased to a total of 4.75 inches of horizontal armor. Torpedo protection for the machinery spaces was also increased. The existing machinery was entirely replaced, and 11 oil can pond boilers and new turbines increased power to 136,000 shaft horsepower, with a resulting maximum speed of between 29.7 and 30.5 knots. The stern was rebuilt and made 25 feet longer. This also helped to increase the speed. The appearance of the class was altered, with a heavy pagoda tower being fitted. The armament was adjusted with the deletion of 2 6-inch guns and the final 4 torpedo tubes. Anti-aircraft armament was increased with 4 Type 89 twin 5-inch guns, and by 1936, 10 twin 25mm mounts. A catapult was added abaft the number 3 turret to launch 3 float planes. It should be noted that Hiei did have a different bridge configuration, being similar to the new Yamatos, with warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy calling it a prototype. Hiei's 4th turret was returned, along with the primary and secondary batteries having increased elevation. Another thing still left out was the new fire control system installed in the ships. The main belt armor was increased to a uniform thickness of 8 inches, as well as other strengthening of critical components and new machinery. It meant that Hiei and her sisters could now keep up and help protect Japan's carriers from threats from the surface and sky. This rebuild comes with some degree of controversy in our time. The Congos were built as battlecruisers, and after their modernization, the Japanese referred to them as battleships, given their upgrades. A lot of naval history enjoyers like to argue about this, so feel free to down in the comments. Within reason, of course. Don't make me come down there. For the sake of not riling people up who might claim I am trying to impose an Anglo-centric definition of ships, I will only be using her name from this point on, and not referring to her designation as either a battlecruiser or battleship, besides maybe once. Anyway, once the reconstruction was complete in 1940, Hiei was inspected and sent off for service, where a vast majority of the next several years were spent in Battleship Division 3, training with her sisters. By November 1941, Japan was ready to strike south. Hiei helped to escort the strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to their launch point for the attack on Pearl Harbor, where, like the other surface vessels, Hiei and her sister Kirishima didn't have much to do. Hiei, during much of the early war, spent her time escorting the carriers, because the Congos, as I mentioned, were some of the only capital ships the Japanese had that could keep up with the carriers. Hiei next assisted in the Java Sea campaign and helped to destroy the elderly Clemson-class destroyer USS Edsall in March 1942. However, her gunnery was not great in this, failing to hit her mark until Edsall had been hit by carrier planes first, firing well over 200 shells at the poor destroyer. Next, Hiei and the 3 other Congos were a part of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike force for the Indian Ocean raids, Again, this is a case of the escorting ships not having anything to do while the carriers did their job. Next, in June, Hiei was assigned to the Midway invasion force and subsequently pulled back with the rest of the Japanese fleet after the defeat in the carrier duel. Hiei continued to help escort ships for the remainder of her career, whether that was the carriers at the Eastern Solomons or her sisters while they bombarded Henderson Field in the Guadalcanal campaign. In that campaign, Hiei would have her first and admittedly last real taste of combat. On the night of November 12th through the morning of the 13th, Hiei, Kirishima, the light cruiser Nagara, and 14 destroyers were a part of a volunteer attack force that was to bombard Henderson Field, which Kongo and Haruna had done successfully a month earlier. To set the scene a bit more, this is what Paul S. Dahl has to say in his book The Imperial Japanese Navy, 1941 to 1945. The situation on Guadalcanal was becoming undurable for both sides. The U.S. Navy, with severely depleted forces and a badly damaged carrier, was still determined to bring in the foot soldiers needed to break the land stalemate. To prevent the Japanese from playing the same role, Halsey began collecting units to block Japanese reinforcements. There were enough planes and pilots at Henderson Field, although they also needed constant reinforcement because of the losses of frequent large-scale Japanese air battles. Both the Americans and the Japanese proceeded to carry out massive troop buildup during the 3 months from August 7th to November 12th. The Japanese were going to take the initiative in the upcoming battle, where Admiral Yamamoto planned to bring in supplies and men on the night of the 14th, backed by the attack group. Where the attack group the night before was supposed to bombard Henderson Field using battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. To counter this threat, American cruiser and destroyer forces under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan were out on the night of the 12th. As the volunteer attack force headed south on the 12th, Rear Admiral Abe's force neared Savo Island at about midnight with some pretty foul weather at their back. Once the weather cleared at 12:40 a.m., the light cruiser Nagara and the battleships Hiei and Kirishima had formed a central column with destroyers on either side of that central column. Given the fact that Abe had ordered 2 course reversals due to the weather, the Japanese formation was a bit confused and struggled to understand where everyone was. At 1:42, the destroyer Udachi sighted enemy ships, this being Callahan's Task Force 67.4. To quote James D. Hornfisher in his book Neptune's Inferno, the U.S. Navy at Guadalcanal, on contact with the Americans, pandemonium broke out within the chain of command of the Japanese force. According to Captain Hara of the Amatsukaze, in the Hiei, Captain Masao Nishida and his gunnery officer debated what type of ordnance the flagship should be loading. Prepared for a bombardment mission, the gunnery officer had Type 3 incendiary and high explosive projectiles loaded in his hoists. They settled in favor of armor-piercing ammunition. But as the crews in the shell decks and the turrets of both Hiei and Kirishima scrambled to remove bombardment rounds from the hoists and ready storage execution, it was clear that execution was more difficult than decision. There was a stampede in the magazines, men pushing and kicking to reach the armor-piercing shells stored deep inside, Hara wrote. Evidently, the Japanese were unsuccessful in switching out their projectiles, judging by the volume of pyrotechnics that burst over Callahan's formation that night. For the leading ships, the shooting would begin at a range so close that mechanical sensors were altogether unnecessary. The Battle of Friday the 13th would go down as the first naval engagement in the steam age to begin with a nearly blind head-on collision in the dark. Things began to open up at about 1:50, which Dahl calls probably the most confused, close-ranged, and horrendous surface engagement of the war. So I'll try my best to detail Hiei's role. The Akatsuki, who was illuminating the light cruiser Atlanta, got the wrong end of her 5-inch guns, although the Akatsuki most likely got torpedoes off, as sources are unclear. Hiei too illuminated and fired on Atlanta, and sources vary on whether or not her salvos or the accidental salvo from San Francisco killed Norman Scott in Atlanta. It is more likely the latter. In any case, Stoll has this to say. Hiei and the Akatsuki paid a price for using their searchlights. The Hiei at once drew fire from the 4 lead American destroyers at 300 to 2,000 yards. The small destroyer guns and machine guns riddled Hiei's topside, and fires broke out across her deck. Admiral Abe, blinded by his fires and confused about the whereabouts of his units, gave little direction during the rest of the battle. The Hiei's fire drew salvo from almost every battery within range, including the 8-inch guns of the San Francisco. Abe then ordered his battleships to retire to the north. The Kirishima turned first, with the Hiei following. The onslaught of metal soon after knocked out Hiei's communication systems. The American destroyers were focusing their gunfire and torpedoes on Hiei, and Probably most famous was the USS Laffey, as she came in so close that Hiei could not depress her guns low enough to actually fire on the destroyer, where Hornfisher has this to say. The Laffey's captain, Lieutenant Commander William E. Hank, rang emergency full stern. Cross-connecting his engine in fire rooms with burners full open, he then signaled emergency full ahead. The captain's ship handling had been a source of consternation and embarrassment to the crew when he showed a willingness to use emergency engine orders during routine docking. Now the circumstances required it. The destroyer leapt forward as Hiei's screws bit into the seas. Surging just past her fantail went the Hiei, so close that Hank could have hit her with a slingshot, Julian Beckton wrote. The destroyer's gunners riddled the Japanese ship with guns of all calibers. A sailor named John H. Jenkins, impressed with the opportunity at hand, ran to a 20mm mount whose operator was hanging lifeless in the harness. Wrapping his arms around the corpse, using it as a shield, he raised the barrel and fired a clip into the battleship's portholes. As fire from the Laffey and the other 3 destroyers raked the Hiei's bridge, Admiral Ave took shrapnel to the face. As heavier blows fell, delivered by American ships farther away, flames and smoke washed through the pilot house. Jenkins saw pieces of the superstructure falling onto the great 14-inch turret below. Hiei punched back at the destroyers and cruisers with her main battery and her 6-inch guns, but the American cruisers and destroyers continued to punch back. Abe's flagship and force continued to fight for their lives, with Kirishima hitting San Francisco and killing Callahan. The Americans now were out both their admirals, so the battle continued to devolve into a melee. One of the most consequential hits to Hiei came from most likely the cruiser San Francisco, tearing a hole in her starboard quarter that quickly flooded the steering room and shorted the steering engine. With her generator short-circuited, Hiei lost use of her turrets. As the battle came to a close around 2 a.m., with Hiei battered by more than 30 shells, ablaze, and barely able to make way as she circled west of Savo Island, and Admiral Abe's intended bombardment of Henderson Field had been thwarted. Hiei was just north of Savo Island without a working rudder, and although the Japanese refused to give up on her, the final chapter of the battle is most aptly dubbed the Battle of the Cripples. The Hiei fired on the Aaron Ward, which was quickly ended when Marine Dauntlesses from Henderson Field found the battleship. Shortly after 7 a.m., a 1,000-pound bomb was planted into Hiei's superstructure. It was the first of many bombs and torpedoes to fall on Hiei. Assailants included planes from the carrier Enterprise and her Torpedo Squadron 10, the Buzzard Brigade, who scored 3 hits at 10 a.m. and rearmed at Henderson, attacking again that afternoon. By around 2:30, she could no longer make way, and her crew was taken off at 4 p.m., and she sank shortly after, the first battleship/battlecruiser lost by the Imperial Japanese Navy during the war. Hiei's end wasn't too rare for the Congos, as they were all lost during the war. Still, Hiei proved that she could take a beating, considering the amount of ordnance it took to eventually sink her, with Hornfisher writing about her before she was a victim of American aircraft. Despite the battering that Hiei took from 58-inch and 85 5-inch hits, there was little underwater damage and not too many floodings aside from the breach of the steering room. I know I called her a battleship and battlecruiser, but let's not fight about it and instead have some debates. So let me know what you guys think about Hiei's career and what you tend to call the Congo class. Thanks again for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great week.